Hi, this is Khalid Beg, and welcome to yet another episode of India This Week. We are joined by none other than Sushant Sareen. Of course, Sushant Sareen needs no introduction. And as we can see with the title, we're discussing the economic crisis in Pakistan. Welcome, Sushant.
Thanks, Khalid, for having me.
Yeah. So, just to give viewers an idea of what's happening currently, as we speak today, the 1 liter of petrol in Pakistan is at 270 Pakistani rupees, and $1 US dollar is worth 270, roughly the same. And if we look at the essential food items, wheat is at 120 rupees per kg, chicken 780 rupees per kg, and mutton 1100, tomato 60 rupees a kg, and things like that, rice 240 rupees a kg. Sushantji, in your article for ORF, you write some very strong lines. You say that Pakistan no longer confronts a crisis of government or governance. It is now contending with the crisis of state. If you could elaborate that for the viewers.
Yeah, because Khalid, I've written that simply because everything that can go wrong in Pakistan is going wrong.
Right.
What I mean by that is that you have the economic crisis on the one hand, which is quite debilitating, and in fact, it's there are horror stories that one is hearing of how even people from the middle classes are now suffering economic distress. And that concept of the Safed Posh having to the streets kind of a deal. So you are having a very serious economic crisis, out of which nobody has any idea how to get out of, except borrow more money. And then, the usual stuff that we should increase our exports and stuff like that, but nobody knows how it is to be done. So that is on one side. On the other side, you have a new wave of terrorism coming into Pakistan. Again, both the economy as well as the security situation is entirely of their own making. And then you have an administration which is completely dysfunctional. You have an army which is scared to intervene, which is unable to assert itself. You have a judiciary which is playing politics. And some of the most despicable characters who are prancing about as, the arbiters of Pakistan's fate. And then you have a politics which is completely polarized. How does a state survive under these multiple challenges when it has, all its external patrons have more or less seem to have washed their hands off it? So the economy is tanking, the politics is failing, and the security situation is deteriorating. What else does a state need to unravel? And I'm not saying that will happen right now, but here, normally it is a country faces an economic crisis. A country faces a constitutional or a political crisis. A country faces a security crisis. A country faces, an environmental crisis. Pakistan is facing multiple crises at the same time. And that is why I say that this is now the single most serious challenge to the survival of the state, even more serious than what it was in 1971.
Okay, big statement there. Also, I really liked one line which you wrote in the next para, and we would want you to elaborate on that. You said that what Pakistanis think that they can forge unity and evolve a consensus, they will be able to come up with a plan. What they don't understand is that consensus can be evolved around a plan, not a plan around a consensus. So if you could make us understand the mindset of the population.
Yeah, because I've just recounted to you the kind of problems the country faces, right? The severity of the crisis. Now, normally what happens is that when you have these kind of crises emerging, you should have somebody who says that, okay, fine, this is how we get out of it. In Pakistan, what you hear normally from politicians, from talking heads, from the so-called pundits, I should use the word pundits. Pakistanis will take umbrage to a use of a Hindu word for them. But the so-called intellectuals, you name it, the technocrats, when everything is said and done, you will hear this constant refrain that everybody should get together, and put their heads together and think of how we can all get out of this problem and have a consensus on how we could get out of this problem, which means that you have to have a consensus for a plan. Right. My contention is that what you should have, and regardless of whether that plan is workable, not workable, feasible, not feasible, you have to have at least a framework of a plan, not concepts, not that we should increase exports and then we'll be out of trouble. No, that's a concept. How are you going to increase your export? What are the building blocks of what you want to do? Nobody tells you that, right? So you have some guy who will drop jargon. So many kids are going hungry. So many people are out of a job. So many kids are stunted. Okay, fine. Those figures are really nice, and you've done your virtue signaling. How do you propose to get out of it? What are the building blocks that you have in mind? And then the moment, for example, you say that, okay, fine, are you ready to cut defense expenditure? No, but we can't cut defense expenditure because we have such challenges. Can you cut government? No, but government is already not so big. Can you cut this? No, we can't do this because that group will get angry. Can you do something else? No, somebody else will get angry. You really have no plan. And then you say we should all, put our heads together and think of a plan and have a consensus around it. So my point is, somebody has to come up with a cogent, coherent plan and then bring people on board. For example, Khalid, when you probably weren't born at that time. But when we went in for economic reforms in 1991.
Yeah, I was 6 years old. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, but you were virtual, right? But, at that point of time, there was no consensus. In fact, the consensus was that these reforms are disastrous because we had all been brainwashed, and I count myself among the brainwashed, by that nonsense of Nehruvian socialism, right? So there was no consensus, and the constant refrain was that these guys are selling out our country, that, how will we survive without the public sector? That goddamn public sector never really served anybody. But, the commanding, because we had all been fed on that diet, commanding heights of the economy, the temples of modern India, all of that, jargon was us. So there was really no consensus that we need to reform. And yet you had somebody like P.V. Narasimha Rao, who in my book, and I have no hesitation in saying this, was probably the greatest prime minister India had, because he was the captain of the ship when it was in the most torrid waters of its 75-year journey. The worst period, or none, right? We had two insurgencies, we had a huge communal conflagration, we had a bankrupt economy, we had enormous political problems, and the man, steered the country out of those troubled waters. And along with him, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was the nuts and bolts guy. So Narasimha Rao handled the politics of it. Dr. Manmohan Singh and Dr. Mantek Singh Ahluwalia handled the nuts and bolts part of it. right? And the two together took us out of the, the deep waters or the stormy waters. So they came up with the plan. And then, slowly and steadily, there was a kind of a consensus around the economic reform. It was not that they first were trying to get a consensus. How do you get a consensus in a country of 240 million people? How do you get a consensus? Right?
You can't.
Pakistan is in many ways, it is as diverse a country. Not as much, but a pretty diverse country, right? Both in terms of ideology, in terms of religious sects, in terms of different political interests, in terms of its own political system. It's a very diverse country. So people will have diverse opinions. And to evolve a consensus without having any kind of a plan in place is impossible, because everybody will be pulling in different directions. But if you have a plan, then you can bring in people onto it.
Yeah.
So that logic, which was I saying, that this concept कि सब सर जोड़ के बैठ जाते हैं और फिर सोचते हैं कि क्या करना है. यार टाइम निकल गया. You don't have the time for that anymore.
Right. Very interesting. Very interesting. Sushant, while I was researching on this topic, you are the only author I saw who's actually given the figures. Like, their budget for the financial year 23 is an estimated net federal government revenue of Pakistani Rupee 5.03 trillion. And you argue that the debt servicing itself is 3.95 trillion. And with interest rates going up, that debt servicing is 5.2 trillion. Could you elaborate on this and break this down? Because usually, all of us pretend that finance samajh aata hai, in a very layman's language. How do these figures add up and how bad the situation is?
So it's like this, Khalid. You bought an iPhone, okay? You bought it on EMIs, and the EMI is 15,000 rupees a month, but your salary is just 10,000 rupees.
Okay.
Get it? It's as simple as.
Right.
The Pakistanis have taken loans. So for the longest, for at least 2.5 decades, how it started off was that, Pakistan is a federal system. So the total revenue, a large chunk of the revenue then goes to the provinces. And then there is something called the net federal revenue, which is basically the resources which are there with the federal government. Okay. Out of the taxes and the levies and other non-tax income. So this is the amount of money, that 5 trillion rupees is the amount of money that the central government or the federal government sitting in Islamabad has to discharge its functions. Okay. Now, for the longest, what used to happen was that 2 or 3 heads would consume the entire thing and everything else was done through loans. So, for example, it used to be debt servicing, used to be almost the largest, then used to be defense spending. And then, you could add either subsidies or you could add, running of the civil government or another 1 or 2 things. So about 3 items would consume the entire revenue and everything else was through loans. And what started happening was that the revenue was just enough for defense and debt servicing. Everything else was through loans. Now the situation, about 3 or 4 years back, the situation was reached that the revenue was enough only for debt, and even a major chunk of the defense spending was through borrowing. And finally, it has now reached a situation where the revenue of the federal government is not even enough for debt servicing, which means that you have to actually take loans to even service your debt. That means you have to take more loans to pay your EMIs in pure layman language. That means you're completely broke, man. Okay. And that is a classic debt trap situation where you're taking loans to pay off previous loans and your income is just not able to match up. And everything you're spending is through loans. And already your loan portfolio has reached a level where you can't service it through your running income. Now, it makes sense to take loans if it is for some productive purpose. Okay, so if you're setting up a studio and you take a loan and that studio is going to earn you money, it makes sense. But if you're taking a loan so that you can go into the market and, binge on your favorite food, then that's stupid, right? And that's what the Pakistanis have been doing. So now a situation has been reached, uh, especially this year, because according to the budget, there was still some space left. That 5 trillion was the revenue with the federal government, but almost 4 trillion rupees was to almost 80% of that net federal revenue was to go into debt servicing, and about 20% of it would go into defense, but that would not cover all of defense. So a large part of the defense spending would be through debt. But now the latest data which has come out in December suggests that debt servicing alone will be more than the estimate for the revenue of the year. And that is as broke as you can get. So that is why I was pointing this out, and that's been a steady deterioration over the last 20 odd years. And this is despite the fact that for a fair bit of time, from around 2001 after 9/11 till about 2015, 2016, they had received a debt moratorium, a debt rescheduling because of 9/11. That is what the Western countries had given them. Some part of their debt was written off, the rest of it was rescheduled and reprofiled. And as a result, they had a buffer of almost 15 years. They blew it. They lived it up. They spent money like it was going out of fashion. They made absolutely stupid, wonky policies. And by 2016, all the debt which had been rescheduled, those payments started becoming due. By that time, they had gotten into this so-called game-changing CPEC, and that created its own problems and its own debt burdens. And meanwhile, they had gone in for these independent power producers to produce electricity. That also caused a lot of debt problems within the country because the energy economics is totally broken up. So it's been a combination of factors which has led them to a state where they are now insolvent.
Also, another thing, Sushant, you said that IMF this time, the International Monetary Fund, is not going to take the bait, and unless and until Pakistan do some major restructural work, they're not going to again bail them out. And what I understand, just in a day or two before, they had to hike the petrol prices because of which 22% to show them that we are taking measures. So, if you could talk us through about that, how IMF's role is there right now.
Yeah. So look, traditionally, what has happened is that the Pakistanis have gone into IMF programs whenever they've got into difficulty, which is every couple of years. Mm-hmm. To the IMF program, then they get one or two installments, and after that they come out of the IMF program and they don't continue with it anymore. Simply because they've tided over that difficult period and now they don't need the IMF, so why should we reform? And this has been going on for a fair bit of time. Among the last programs they took was one in 2013. That was the only one which they completed. That is the first IMF structural program which they completed. But even in that, they got something like 15 or 16 waivers on some of the benchmarks which the IMF sets for countries that, look, this is where you have to reach so that this program which we have designed becomes effective. And that structural reforms actually take place so that the country and its economy comes on a much more viable and sustainable path. Now, they haven't, even the last one, which they claim that they had successfully completed, which was the only one to which they can make that claim, had been done because they'd got 15, 16 waivers. Now, this time, again, they were very confident that, we will plead with the IMF that, mar gaye, lut gaye, doob gaye, all sorts of things have happened to us. So please cut us some slack, give us some concession. But it hasn't happened. I think the IMF has wisened up to what the games the Pakistanis play. So, and which is quite uncharacteristic. Perhaps it's a function of geopolitics, nobody needs the Pakistanis anymore. In 2013 to 2016, Pakistan was still needed by the Americans and the Europeans and the biggest shareholders in IMF. And so maybe they were ready to cut some slack for the Pakistanis. But now Nobody needs them, really. So the IMF is not ready to relent on the structural benchmarks which they've set for them and the conditionalities which they've given them. And look, none of these conditionalities are extraordinary. What are these conditionalities saying? Essentially, to cut the claptrap, these conditionalities are saying that the Pakistanis must foot their own bills. That the Pakistanis have to come on make sustainable policies so that the economy can come out of the rut in which it is. It's not an easy task, but it has to be done to make those structural adjustments. Otherwise, the economy sinks or it continues to stay in this kind of a situation. And so they have suggested a number of measures, which in the wisdom of the IMF, and one can agree or disagree with it, but you disagree with the lender of the last resort at your own peril. Now, the Pakistanis thought that, like other times, they can negotiate their way out of trouble. But it hasn't happened. And then they've used those, the traditional methods of negotiation, disinformation for one, some very fancy accounting practices, some very sharp accounting practices, innovative ones, and very creative accounting practices to show, that they are actually delivering, but the IMF is smartened up to it all. Then they thought that maybe they'll try and get the Americans and some of the other countries to put pressure on the IMF to relent. That didn't work. Then they pleaded that, the floods came and a lot of suffering has happened. They've not done a damn thing for the flood affected people. But, it was a good opportunity, so why let it go waste? So they used the floods as an excuse to get the IMF to relent. The IMF has not relented, although the IMF did say that, okay, fine, you show us your accounts and we will, give you some leeway on the monies which you have spent for the flood affected people, but otherwise you have to stick true to your targets. So they tried that. That has not worked. They've tried virtually everything. None of it has worked. And I think the last thing which they have now tried, which could be a precursor or a preparation to walking out of the IMF and perhaps even defaulting, which is that, if you read today's newspapers, all the papers have been fed a particular line by one particular person or one or two of the top officials who have said that, the IMF has been asking us, changing the goalposts and asking us to do things which we don't think are in national interest, basically alluding to or maybe, referring to the nuclear program or the missile program and stuff like that, that maybe on defense expenditure and nuclear and missile program, the IMF is asking us to do something. I think that is the kind of thing which they're trying to build up to. And so that in tomorrow the IMF program doesn't come, they have some fallback position politically that, look, we did not compromise on something as important as this. I don't know whether that will work or it will not work, but it's also a way of putting pressure on the IMF. Perhaps the last, ploy which they have to try and get something out of the IMF. So the bottom line is that the IMF is sticking to its guns. So far, at least till now, while I'm speaking to you, the IMF has refused to, back down on what it's demanding of the Pakistanis. And frankly, what the IMF is demanding of the Pakistanis is really tough. But it's required, because if you don't impose that level of toughness, then you don't wean the Pakistanis off the path they have been on for so many years now, so many decades, in fact. And if you don't do it right now, then you'll have to, this whole cycle will repeat itself. So I think if they implement the IMF program, there's hell to pay. And of course, if they don't implement the IMF program, there's going to be hell to pay. The consequences are going to be horrible no matter what they do. So it's a very difficult choice or dilemma whether they should go ahead with the IMF program. It will save them up to a point, but not entirely. And if they don't go in for the IMF program, then of course the economy melts down. It's what I call Sri Lanka on steroids. Because unlike Sri Lanka, this is a country of 230, 240 million people. And already things have been kind of not really going their way. So there's going to be hell to pay. And even if they default, then, apart from the economic meltdown that takes place, you will still need to go back to your lenders to renegotiate your loan. And they will still impose even more onerous demands on you than what they are doing right now. So it's not something, which is really palatable for them. So whichever way you look at it, it's a bad situation.
Sure. Moving away from that, I saw that you had written quite an angry tweet to this article written by Chetan Bhagat in Times of India, that Pak tailspin creates opportunity to set reunification narrative. And I had a good laugh that India's doing great. We just provide, like Joe Biden just said that we are providing 1 million jobs with the acquisition of the highest number of civilian aeroplanes that Tata Group did. And Chetan Bhagat's argument is that now is the time that we should tell them, let's just come back together as two nations. So I just want a quick response from you.
Yeah, I thought you were doing a serious podcast. Chetan Bhagat, the guy is a dumb guy. Yaar. He might be a good writer of pulp fiction, but
I mean, this is the Times of India editorial. That's the problem, because ultimately
that's what amazes me, that newspapers like the Times of India, the biggest newspaper in this country, publishes such drivel, which I find very difficult to. I wonder how they can publish such nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. The guy has not thought this through. He just got an idea and he probably thought he'll just flog it like any of his novels. This is a serious business. Number one, India doesn't have the capacity to save Pakistan from itself. And I think we should be mindful of that. Number two, I don't see any reason why you should save an enemy country. Number three, if you have so much money to spend, then there are better things to spend it on. You can uplift your own people, you can build some nice fancy universities. You can do so much more with that money. This nonsensical Mother India complex that we have, that Mother India must go and save everybody. What nonsense is it here? So it's frustrating to read these people, half-baked knowledge, even more half-baked analysis, and just the sheer nonsense of it all is just galling. क्या बोलेगा आदमी फिर? अब थोड़ा मर्यादा में भी रहना पड़ता है, तो वो जो नॉर्मल पंजाबी इंस्टिंक्ट्स होते हैं, नहीं तो नौकरी वोकरी छूट जाएगी, I'll get cancer and other things. But it's just frustrating and galling to read and hear such people, because they haven't thought this through. Look, for example, the Sri Lankans got into trouble, right? Again, they got into trouble from their own making. But I would be the last person to say that we should not, rise up to help Sri Lanka, even if it means, taking some trouble for ourselves, simply because there is a lot of positivity as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. At least there is a lot of potential in that relation going forward. Sri Lankans are not the kind of people who stab you in the back. You look at just read the discourse in Pakistan, just hear it, just see what people are saying. And it becomes very clear that, even if you were in a position to help these people, all that they are interested in is to get out of this immediate crisis, become economically strong so that they can take you on. Right? It's not that, okay, fine, I have a problem with Khalid. I am in real mess, and Khalid, like a nice Samaritan, comes and helps me out of that mess. And I come to know that, look, Khalid isn't such a bad guy. So maybe, we should reconcile with each other. It's not that. It is, okay, fine. I'm in a heap of shit. Khalid has come and pulled me out. The moment I come out and I recover, I'm going to put Khalid in that heap of shit. Right. That's the mentality you're dealing with. And if that's the mentality you're dealing with, why should you pull that guy out of the mess he is in? That's my point.
True. No, also the fact is that the very identity and the worldview is anti-India. That's the existential life, right? And so how can that ever come out, right? So that cannot change, right? So on the other hand, we had our external affairs minister, Mr. S. J. Shankar, say that when he was asked about this issue, and this is the first time I've seen, strong words like that, when he said that no country can come out of such a difficult situation if its basic industry is terrorism. I mean, that's as clear a thing. Anything on that statement by the
I think that was a barb at the Pakistanis, which completely identify with. But I think the more substantive thing was what he had said just before he said this. That I don't think we are in the business of helping them. Something to that effect. I paraphrase.
Okay.
He made it very clear that the government of India is not looking at that right now. Right. Not only that, I don't know if you saw the podcast of Smita Prakash interviewing Dr.
Saw it in parts. Yeah, it was a lovely.
Right. So I think it was an hour-long interview.
Right.
And what was striking was, apart from 2 sentences on Pakistan, there was nothing else. There was a complete absence of Pakistan in that particular interview. Normally, Pakistan is something, it's a clickbait kind of a thing.
Right.
But even the coverage of that interview did not even mention the P word.
Right.
So, government is trying to move away from this thing. Or at least I hope so. Right. You never know, with this Mother India complex coming back. But I hope that these guys are getting over it. Seems like it. And I think that is the way to go about it. And the other thing was, of course, what Dr. Jaishankar saying, apart from the barb, was also a statement of fact that if your value in the world is your nuisance value, then people are not going to be coming to support you and pull you out of trouble because you are a nice guy and you got into trouble, right? I think only simply because, or they're looking at you simply because of your nuisance value, which is what you have tried to scare the world with, which is again something that the Pakistanis have tried with the IMF and others, that look, if you don't help us, there are these mad mullahs waiting in the wings, and there'll be this huge turmoil and people will come out on the streets. There'll be an Islamic revolution in Pakistan. There'll never be an Islamic revolution in Pakistan. There will never be a revolution per se in Pakistan. Pakistanis are not revolutionary people, right? They are not the kind of people who will go in for a revolution. They don't have any stomach for it, right? They have a lot of poetry for it, but they don't have any stomach. So, but they've tried to sell that. Now, if that is what your sole USP is, then all that you're selling to the world is negativity. And you want the world to pull you out because of the negative connotations attached to you, rather than something positive to offer to the world. What is it that the Pakistanis offer to the world which is positive?
Right.
Nothing. Think of anything.
Right. So I think we can clearly conclude with the fact that the next, lot of years, 3, 4, 5 years are going to be very tough on the economic front for majority of Pakistanis across the economic spectrum.
No, I don't think that the elite is going to be affected as much, because the Pakistani elite is self-centered, selfish, obnoxious, It grabs whatever it can. It is ruthless, and it doesn't believe in sharing. So I don't think the pain that is going to be inflicted in Pakistan is going to be distributed equally. I suspect that it will fall disproportionately on the poor, which means that the financial divides will widen. It means that there will be a massive increase in poverty and economic distress. The elite will keep living it up.